Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be covering chapter 6 from your Marrow text, which is on bones and skeletal tissue. So we're not actually going to be talking about all the bones in our skeleton. I'll name a few of them. But you will be spending time in lab to learn the names of all of the bones and all of the little markings on the bones. So in lecture, we're really just talking about the gross anatomy of just bones, the structures of bones themselves, some microscopic anatomy, and then physiology of how bones are made, developed, and how they regrow and repair themselves. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about just bone and cartilage anatomy. And obviously, this is the skeletal system, so it makes sense that bone is included in here. But some of you may be saying, well, why do we have cartilage anatomy? We already talked about that in the histology chapter. But cartilage is really important to the skeletal system because the human skeleton initially is just made of cartilage, okay? And as the fetus develops, that cartilage structure, blueprint, if you will, is going to be changed into bone. Okay, so cartilage is the precursor for all the bones in our body, which makes sense because they're both a type of connective tissue. They're both derived from the same embryonic tissue, mesenchyme. So the mesenchyme becomes cartilage first, and then eventually will become bone. Okay, so some areas are going to remain cartilage to give the bones themselves a little bit more flexibility, more articulations at the joints, but most of the cartilage in our embryonic skeleton is going to be converted into bone. Okay, so just kind of a review on the just types of cartilage and how they may relate to the skeletal system, just besides the embryonic skeleton. So we have hyaline cartilage, right, which functions to provide support, flexibility, and resilience. It's the most abundant type and contains a lot of collagen fibers. You're going to find it a lot of places in the skeleton. So you're going to see it as articular cartilage. And think of where your arms and legs are articulating. Anywhere there's a joint, you're going to have articular cartilage, okay? And it's just going to kind of cushion the bones as they're rubbing up against each other to make sure that, you're not damaging the bones themselves. So articular cartilage of the joints. You have costal cartilage, which is the cartilage that's connecting your ribs to the sternum. Okay, so that is cartilage. You have in your respiratory system some respiratory cartilage in the larynx, which is shown up here, which is really not important for this chapter. And then nasal cartilage, right? So your nose isn't actually a bone. It's made up of hyaline cartilage. Okay, and hyaline cartilage, too, is the cartilage that's going to make up embryonic skeleton. Okay, so your fetal skeleton will be made up of hyaline cartilage that will eventually be turned into bone. You also have, obviously, elastic cartilage, similar to hyaline, but contains the elastic fibers, which gives it the stretch and elasticity that it has. It's found in the external ear and epiglottis. The epiglottis, if you don't know, is at the top of your trachea, and the ear is on the side of your head. And then finally, fibrocartilage has really thick collagen fibers and really good tensile strength. And you can find it in the meniscus of your knee. So you have articular cartilage at the joint, but in the meniscus itself is fibrocartilage. And then also the intervertebral discs. So this red between your vertebrae, all those little red discs between all of the vertebrae are fibrocartilage. Okay, and you're also, I don't know why it doesn't say it here, but in the pubic symphysis, I'm going to add that. Your pubic symphysis between your two oxcoxae or hip bones is also made of fibrocartilage. So fibrocartilage is really in areas that have a lot of tensile stress on them. So think about all of the stress that's in your knee joint, all of the pressure and weight put on in between the vertebrae, and then also between your two hip bones. Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about cartilage. We're going to talk about especially hyaline cartilage throughout the rest of the chapter, but there are all these types of cartilages found within the skeleton, you could say. But for bones obviously have a lot of important functions. So support for the body and soft organs, just holding everything up. Protection. So it covers a lot of really important organs, such as your spinal cord. So your spinal cord runs through your vertebrae. Your brain is housed within your cranium. And then other vital organs like your lungs are under the rib cage, your heart's under the rib cage, right? Things that you don't want to get damaged are behind that hard bone. Functions in movement, so provides places for muscles to attach, and with those attachments, the muscles, when they contract, will actually move your skeleton. Mineral and growth factor storage. So calcium, phosphorus, and other growth factors can be found within bone. So it's kind of like a reservoir, holds extra of those things. Blood cell formation actually happens within your bones. So the process of blood cell formation is called hematopoiesis. And it occurs in red bone marrow cavities, which are not in every bone, but in certain bones you're going to find red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow is responsible for hematopoiesis, or the making of red blood cells. Functions in triglyceride, which is fat storage. It's stored in bone cavities in yellow bone marrow. Right, so red bone marrow is responsible for blood cell formation. Yellow bone marrow is fat storage. And then finally, some hormone production also happens within bones. So osteocalcin is secreted by bones, and it helps regulate insulin secretion, glucose levels, and metabolism. So a lot of different stuff going on. Kind of cool. Bones do more than you'd think. Okay, we have 206 named bones in the human skeleton. There's a whole lot of them. And we can divide them into two groups based on location. And these locations, or sections, whatever you want to call them, we have discussed before. And a lot of people got these wrong on the first exam. So first you have your axial skeleton, right? The axial part of the body is the skull, vertebrae, and your rib cage. Okay, so the trunk of your body. The appendicular skeleton are the appendages. Okay, so we talked about before about your arms and legs are appendages, right? When we're talking about the skeletal system, the girdles that connect your appendages to the trunk are considered appendicular as well. So your pelvis attaches your legs to your vertebral column, and your pectoral girdle, which is your shoulder blades and clavicle, which we'll talk about in lab, attach your arms to your trunk as well. Okay, so appendicular skeleton are the arms, appendages, legs, as well as the girdles that attach the limbs. Okay, we can classify bones also according to their shape. So there's 4 different classifications. Long bones are longer than they are wide, which that's the name, so that should make sense. These are mostly going to be the bones of your limbs, your appendages. Short bones are going to be short, so a lot of times they're cube-shaped. So the bones in your wrists and ankles, so your bones in your wrist are your carpals, and your ankles are your tarsals, which you'll learn the names of all of those again in lab. Sesamoid bones are a specific type of short bone that forms within a tendon. So you have some of these in your hand, but the main one that we're going to talk about is the patella. But technically, the pisiform is a sesamoid bone as well because it's within a tendon. Okay. We have flat bones that are going to be flat, thin, flat, and oftentimes curved. So your sternum, scapula, your ribs, and most of your skull bones. So the bones that make up your skull are all flat. And then finally, we have irregular bones. So those are the bones that don't really necessarily fit into the other categories. So they're just kind of weird shapes. So for example, your vertebrae and your hip bones. Okay. Also, you have a bunch of little tiny bones in your ear, the stapes, malleus incus, they're known as your ossicles. Those are also considered an irregular bone. Okay. So here's an image that just shows that. Again, long bones are going to be longer than they are, so humerus. The phalanges in your finger are also long bones. Short bones, we have, this one is showing your talus, which is a tarsal, a bone of your ankle, but also the bones of your wrist, the carpals. Flat bones, sternum, your scapula, which you can't see in this picture, but scapula, cranial bones, your ribs are also considered flat. And then irregular, the weird shaped ones, so your vertebrae, pelvis, so on and so forth. Okay. Bones are considered organs because they contain different types of tissues. Remember, tissues are a group of cells with a common function. Organs are a collection of different types of tissue that are working together. Okay, so bones are made up of different types of tissue, so they are considered an organ. Bone tissue, also known as osseous tissue, predominates. But you also have nervous tissue within bones, cartilage, different connective tissues, muscle, epithelial cells, and blood vessels and stuff. So there's a lot of different types of tissues that are associated with the bones that bones couldn't survive without. Okay, and we can talk about bones with 3 levels of structure. So these we talked about in chapter 1, but the gross structure, what you can see with kind of the naked eye, bigger picture items, microscopic, the small stuff, and chemical, even smaller. Okay, so let's start with the gross level of structure. Okay, so I put that up here just if you needed that. So gross anatomy of short, irregular, and flat bones first. Okay, so what you'll see is there is actually 2 different types of bones. You have spongy bone and compact bone. And if you look at this image really quick, you can tell, it's kind of intuitive. This part in the middle is spongy bone, and then on either side is compact bone here, right? You can see the difference pretty easily. So spongy in the middle, compact on either side. So all flat, short, and irregular bones have a setup where you have a compact bone on each outside with a spongy bone in the middle. So I kind of like to think of it like an ice cream sandwich. Okay, and that spongy bone in the middle of this type of bone has this fancy name, the dipole. Don't know how to say it. I don't know how to say a lot of things, sorry. But that is just this part in the middle, right? The spongy bone in this little ice cream sandwich is called the dipole. Okay. The compact bone is also sandwiched. Okay, so you have compact bone, spongy, compact. But if you were to get close enough to the spongy bone or the compact bone, you would see that you have 2 types of membranes sandwiching it. Okay, so you have the periosteum that covers the outside of the compact bone, and the endosteum, which covers the inside of the compact bone. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in again. So we have compact bone on the outside. On the outside of that compact bone is the periosteum, and the inside would be the endosteum. Okay, so you'd have the same thing on the bottom. On the inside, endosteum, outside would be periosteum. Okay, so you have like 3 ice cream sandwiches in this flat bone. Okay, within the spongy bone, in the dipole, you have bone marrow. So there's no defined marrow cavity. It's just going to be within the spongy bone itself, because you can see these little holes, so it's going to be within there. When you look at the bones, well, you're not going to be in lab, so never mind. In lab, we have actual bones, and you'll see that these look like actual holes. They're not filled in. That's because the bone marrow, goes away in those bones. But if you were to see a living bone, the spongy bone, those holes would be filled with marrow. Okay. And then you have hyaline cartilage that's covering areas of the bone that's part of the movable joint. And remember, that's called articular cartilage. Okay. And you'll see here, I think I mentioned it in a later slide, but I'll reinforce it. The spongy bone that's covering it, but you can see there's those spongy areas called trabeculae. Okay, so all of this spongy part, these little, whatever you want to call them, are trabeculae. Okay, so now let's look at long bones, which I don't know why I didn't put that on there. So the other gross anatomy was for short, flat, and irregular bones. Long bones have a little bit of a different structure. So they're still going to have compact bone that is going to be on the outside layer of the entire bone. And it's going to have spongy bone on the inside. So it's kind of hard to see at the top of the bone, but you're going to have compact bone all around the outside, and then all that stuff in the middle is spongy bone. And in some areas, you're going to have thicker compact bone. Okay, and it's always going to look smooth and solid, where spongy is going to be spongy looking. Okay, the spongy bone, like I said, these little needle-like or flat, spongy-looking pieces are called trabeculae. And again, I said this in the last slide, but the trabeculae are filled with some sort of bone marrow. So it can be yellow marrow or red marrow. We'll talk about the differences and where you can find them a little bit later on. Okay. So more about the long bone. So like I said, it has the compact bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside. But the long bone also has some different areas that you need to know. So the first is the diaphysis. Okay, the diaphysis is the tubular shaft that forms the long part of the bone. Okay, so this very long middle part is the diaphysis of the long bone. Okay, it's going to be compact bone with that surrounds, actually, on the ends you'll see spongy bone, but in the very middle you're going to see, here, where did it go? The medullary cavity. Okay, so if I zoom in a little bit on this bone, you see in the middle of diaphysis, you have the medullary cavity, which is this cavity here that is filled with yellow bone marrow. Okay, so the medullary cavity, yellow bone marrow is going to be in the diaphysis. Okay, the epiphyses, or epiphyses, because there's two of them, are going to be at both ends. Okay, so I'll do this in a different color. Epiphyses are at both ends. So you have the proximal epiphysis, which is going to be the part of the bone that's attaching closer to the body, and the distal epiphysis, which is going to be further away from the body. Okay, and again, you have compact bone on the outside, spongy bone on the inside. And like I mentioned previously, articular cartilage is going to cover any kind of area that's going to be involved in a joint. Okay, so that's hyaline cartilage. That's going to be in areas of joints, surfaces, to help protect the bone. Okay, between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, you have a structure called the epiphyseal line. I'll change my color again. Epiphyseal line, which I'll zoom in here. So the epiphyseal line is this, can you see that kind of line that goes through there? That's the epiphyseal line. Okay, and it's important because it's actually remnant of a childhood structure called the epiphyseal plate. And the epiphyseal plate is where bone growth occurs. So obviously children have small bones, or bones need to get a lot longer. So when children are developing, the baby is born, now they're a child. The epiphyseal plate is made up of cartilage, and the cartilage is going to grow into bone and lengthen the bone. Okay, so the epiphyseal plate is really a cool structure. And if you see the line where that it's no longer cartilage, but it's ossified solid bone, that tells you that the individual is done growing. Okay. All right. There are two types of membranes that we can find. I already mentioned these, but periosteum and endosteum. So periosteum is a white double-layered membrane that covers the external surfaces of the bone. So you can see periosteum here, this membrane that's covering the whole outside. Okay, so be right up tight with the surface of the exterior layer of the bone. There's actually two layers to the periosteum. We have the more superficial fibrous layer that is dense, irregular connective tissue consisting of Sharpey's fibers that secure the osteogenic layer to the bone matrix. Okay, so Sharpey's fibers are just kind of connecting the membrane with the bone. And then we have the osteogenic layer, which is the inner layer that contains osteogenic stem cells. And these types of cells we'll talk about in a little more depth later on. But osteogenic cells are going to give rise to pretty much all bone cells. So they're going to be the stem cells that are going through mitosis, right? Mitosis, and dividing and creating the bone cells. Okay. Within the periosteum, you have a lot of nerve fibers. You have blood vessels perforating, and they go into the shaft through these things called nutrient foramens. Okay, so a foramen is just a hole, but the inside of the bone needs blood. So there's these little holes in your bones that these vessels and nerves are going to go through to get into the bone matrix itself. Okay, and those are called nutrient foramen. Again, foramen just means holes. Okay, and the periosteum is going to be an anchoring point for tendons and ligaments, so where those are actually going to attach. Okay, so that's the periosteum on the outside of the bone. The endosteum is going to be on the inside. Okay, so this whole inside layer right there, right, lining, in this case, the medullary cavity would be the endosteum. Okay, so it's covering the whole medullary cavity in the inside of compact bone, but it's also covering the trabeculae of the spongy bone. Okay, so it's going to be all on the inside of the bone. So anywhere there's gaps or the places that bone marrow would reside, you'll see the endosteum. Okay, there's going to also be a bunch of canals that are passing through compact bone that we'll talk about in a minute, and it's going to be lining those as well. So literally any holes or spaces, gaps within the bones are going to be lined with the endosteum. Okay, and the endosteum also has those osteogenic cells that are going to be responsible for differentiating and creating new bone cells. Okay, so those are the membranes of the bones. And then we can also talk about the hematopoietic, there we go, tissues in bones, which are the tissues that are making blood. Okay, so red bone marrow is found within the trabecular cavities of spongy bone and the dipole of the flat bones, which have the trabecular cavities as well, such as your sternum. Okay. In newborns, you're actually going to find red bone marrow in the medullary cavities. In adults, the medullary cavity turns into yellow bone marrow, right? So that yellow stuff is the medullary cavity. So in adults, you're only going to find red marrow in the trabeculae of certain bones. So the femur and humerus, you're going to find a lot of red bone marrow, but most of it is going to occur in flat bones, dipoles. Okay, so the flat bones with those little sandwiches, the dipole, spongy bone in the middle, is going to be responsible in adults for most of the red bone marrow, and the hematopoietic tissue. It's getting harder to say. Okay, and yellow bone marrow can actually convert into red if a person is anemic or is not producing enough red blood cells. You can see that their yellow marrow actually can turn into red marrow, which is interesting. Okay, and then the last bit of gross anatomy here is just bone markings. So bones aren't just going to be perfectly smooth. They're going to have little divots and ridges and crests. And those are what we call bone markings. And they're important because they're the site of attachment for muscles, ligaments, tendons. And they can also be involved in joint formations. So where other bones are going to join together, or little holes, conduits for blood vessels and nerves to get through. Okay, so there's a lot of different types of markings. We have what we call projection, which is an outward bulge, okay, which happens naturally on the bone, but it can also happen due to increased stress from muscle pulls or modification for joints. We can see depressions, which are just divots, so some sort of bowl or groove that can serve as passageways for vessels and nerves, or also play a role in joints. So in our hip bone, we're going to have a depression called the acetabulum, which is going to be in the hip bone, and it's going to be where the head of the femur connects. Okay, and then we can also have openings in the bones, which are holes or canals that serve as passageways for blood vessels and nerves. Okay, so those need to get through the bone. So our a one that comes to mind is we have what we call the jugular foramen. It's my favorite one. I don't know, maybe not. But your jugular vein is going to go through the jugular foramen. Okay, and the carotid canal, your carotid artery goes through. You have the external acoustic meatus that your ear canal goes through. So there's a lot of different holes in the bones that stuff's going to go through. And you'll talk about this in a lot more detail in lab. So I'm not going to get into all of these right now and waste your time because you're going to learn all of these in lab. But these are all the different markings that you're going to need to know. So you should know the description of them, of the different terms. And then also in lab, you're going to need to know the specific ones. So like I mentioned earlier, you have the external acoustic meatus, okay, which is where, again, your ear goes into your skull. Your ear canal goes through your skull to your brain. So a meatus is just a canal-like passageway. Okay, so if you know these general terms now, it's going to help a lot when you have to memorize the specific ones later on. Okay, so that's the gross anatomy. Now we're going to move on and talk about the microscopic anatomy. So compact bone, we'll start there, also known as lamellar bone, consists of a few different microscopic structures that you need to know. So we'll go into detail, like we always do, on all of these. But you have the osteon, you have a few different canals and caniculi, and interstitial and circumferential lamellae. Okay, so let's start with the osteon. So the osteon is the structural unit of compact bone, and it is an elongated cylinder that runs parallel to the long axis of a bone. Okay, so this whole thing over here is kind of showing you what an osteon looks like. Okay, so it's a kind of rings of bone on top of each other, and they run parallel with the bone. So if this is like your femur, right, your other femur, you'd have a bunch of these running along the length of the femur, if that makes sense, with the bone, long ways. Okay, The cylinder itself consists of several rings of the bone matrix that are called lamellae. So you can see here the lamellae. So each one of these rings that goes around the osteon is a lamellae. Okay. The lamellae have collagen fibers that are going to be running in different directions to provide different types of strength. So you can see the collagen fibers going all different ways to make sure that your bones are strong and resistance to any kind of stress, no matter what the direction it is. So I just said that, withstand stress and resist twisting. And you're going to find that between these collagen fibers, you're going to have what we call bone salts, which we'll talk about that a little bit more, but those make up the matrix of the bone. Okay. So that's an osteon, kind of the structural unit of compact bone. Again, you're only going to find this in compact bone. Okay. Spongy bone is made up of the sponges, so you're not going to have this compact, dense structure. Okay, so if you take a bone and do like a little cross section here, this is your femur, it looks like. So if you're looking again just at the compact bone, so you can see you have spongy bone more deep, but on the outside is compact bone, and you have these osteons. Okay, so each one of these like little bullseye things is an osteon, and it's going to run down the length of this entire bone. Okay, within the osteon, like I said in the previous slide, you have the lamellae, which are going to be the circumferential like rings. So if we look, I'm going to zoom in on this osteon here. So each of like the bullseyes of the osteon are the lamellae. Okay, so those are all lamellae. Okay, kind of cool. In the middle of the osteon, you're also going to have what's called the central canal. So you can see that kind of hole right in the middle here, central canal. And it's going to hold all the veins, nerves, arteries, and all the different things that, you know, are running through the bone. Okay. Oops, sorry. So, like I said, central or Haversian canal runs through the core of the osteon, contains blood vessels, nerve fibers. We have another structure called perforating or Volkmann's canals that line with the endosteum that occur at right angles to the central canal. So I'll show you those in a second. But basically, they're just connecting all the central canals, medullary cavity, and the periosteum together. So they're kind of connecting everything. We also have structures called lacunae, which we talked about when we talked about the cartilage. So lacunae translates to a little lake. So they're going to be little holes or lakes within that dense bone tissue that's going to contain osteocytes. And osteocytes are bone cells. And I'm going to write mature bone cells. Okay. We also have structures called caniculi, which are going to be little tiny canals that connect lacunae to each other and to the central canal, right? Because all of our blood and nerves, all that stuff is running through the central canal, and the bone matrix is really hard. So in order for the nutrients and stuff to get from the blood to the osteocytes, the actual bone cells that need those nutrients, we have to have these little caniculi to connect everything. Okay, and I'll show you all of these in a second. And then we also have interstitial lamellae and circumferential lamellae. So if you remember, lamellae are the rings of the bullseye that make up the osteon. Okay, so we have rings of bullseyes that make up the osteons. So like that, let's say, right? Those are 4 osteons. When we make those rings, you can see in this middle area, there's nothing there. We can't make another osteon that fills that space because there's always going to be spaces in between. So we have what are called interstitial lamellae that are little rings in between the other actual osteon. So the interstitial aren't actually part of the osteon. They're just filling in gaps. Okay. Then we also have circumferential lamellae that are just deep to the periosteum, which means they're around the whole outside of the bone. Okay. And I'll show you those right here. So first let's start talking about, show you these lamellae. So again, we have the lamellae of the osteons themselves, right? This spot in the middle, it's hard to see, those would be these interstitial lamellae that we talked about. Okay, so between the spaces of all the osteons. The circumferential lamellae are lamellae that are going to run all the way around the outside of the bone. So all these are circumferential lamellae. Okay, what else do we talk about? We talked about our central canal running through the osteons, right? We also have perforating canals. So this guy here would be a perforating canal. This guy here would be a perforating canal that runs perpendicularly to connect the central canals together and connect it to the medullary cavity in the middle. We talked about, if we zoom in, so again, remember the lamellae are those hard bone matrix rings. We have little gaps within those called lacunae. So these little gaps in the lamellae are lacunae, which remember are the little lakes. And inside of the lakes, you have your osteocytes. So these red little dots are the actual individual bone cells. Okay, so it's a connective tissue. So the majority of bone is that matrix, right, made of different fibers and minerals and all that stuff. But you have actual osteocytes, the bone cells, within the lacunae. And then the caniculi are the little rivers, I like to think of them. These little canals that are going to connect the lacunae together and connect to the lacunae to the central canal as well. Okay, so the caniculi, I think of the little rivers leaving the lakes. And I think that was everything. Was that? Yeah. Okay. So that is the microscopic anatomy of compact bone, right? This is all just for compact. Spongy bone is a different story. So spongy bone, obviously we already kind of talked about this, but we don't have those osteons like we do in compact bone because it's spongy, and we have the trabeculae instead. It appears like it's just poorly organized, but actually it's organized along the lines of stress to help bones resist stress and breakage. So the way that this like sponge is laid out actually is meaningful. All these little trabeculae add extra strength to the bone. There are no osteons, but the trabeculae do technically contain lamellae, just not in those nice pretty patterns in the concentric rings. There are osteocytes that have, and there's caniculi, all of that stuff in there, but you normally won't see diagrams of that. Okay? And since we don't have central canals, instead we have capillaries running through the endosteum, which if you remember is the inner membrane lining the compact bone, and also it's lining the trabeculae. So all of the outside of this trabeculae will be covered in endosteum as well. Okay, so that's some microscopic anatomy. Let's spend some time talking more about the types of bone cells. Okay, so there's 5 major cell types. Each have a specialized function and all come from the same basic cell types. Okay, so there's going to be a slide for each of these, but these are the 5. So osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, which we've already talked about, are those mature cells. We have bone lining cells, and then osteoclasts. Okay, so osteogenic cells, we also already talked about, are the stem cells that are going to be making new bone tissue. So they're called osteoprogenitor cells. They are mitotically active stem cells that are found in the membranes around the bone, so the periosteum and the endosteum. Okay, they are going to be able to differentiate into osteoblasts or the bone lining cells, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of them obviously are going to stay as those osteogenic stem cells so they can continue to form new bone cells when they need to. Okay. Osteoblasts are considered bone-forming cells. So osteogenic cells make bone cells. These make bone cells. I don't know why I'm writing in all caps. Osteoblasts makes the bone matrix, let's call it, which is known as the osteoid. Okay, so osteoblasts are secreting the osteoid. So the osteoid is made up of those collagen fibers, right, which we talked about in the lamellae, are running in all different directions, and then also different calcium binding proteins. Collagen makes up about 90% of the bone's proteins, though. Okay, osteoblasts are also actively mitotic, so they can divide and create new cells as well. Okay, so we have osteogenic and osteoblasts. Our osteocytes are the cells, I'm going to say, in lacunae, right, which are within the lamellae. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Oh, it says it right there. I didn't have to write it. That are no longer dividing, right? So they're mature, not dividing. They help to maintain the bone matrix and act as stress or strain sensors. So if there's some sort of mechanical stress or stimuli, it will communicate that information to other cells to initiate bone remodeling. Okay, so osteoblasts and osteoclasts are going to be responsible for bone modeling. So we already talked about osteoblasts, how they secrete bone matrix. So I like to think of those. Osteoblasts build, because they're secreting all of those proteins needed for the bones. Osteoclasts actually destroy bone. So I like to think osteoclasts chew. Blasts build, clasts chew. They chew up the bone and get rid of it. Okay, so if there's too much stress or force on the bone, or there's some sort of damage to the bone, osteocytes will sense that and send the information to osteoblasts and clasts to do some remodeling. Okay, bone lining cells are ones that you're not going to hear about very often, but they're flat cells that are on the bone surfaces, believed to help maintain the matrix. On the external bone surface, they're called periosteal cells by the periosteum. Internal surface, endosteal cells. So they're just there, also helping a little bit. Not super exciting. And then finally, osteoclasts, which I just said. Clasts, think chew. They are derived from the same stem cells that become macrophages. I don't know if I said it in previous chapters when we talked about macrophages, but macrophages, macro is big, phage means eater. So macrophage is a big eater. That's me. I'm a macrophage. So they're going to be responsible for chewing up and eating cells that are no longer needed, or the tissue, bone tissue that's no longer needed. So they're giant multinucleate cells. They function in bone reabsorption, it's called, which is just the breakdown of bone. When they're active, they're in these little depressions you can find in the bone called reabsorption bays. They have ruffled borders that serve to increase surface area to help degrade the bone faster with enzymes. And it also helps seal off the area from surrounding matrix so they can actually eat like a specific part of the bone and aren't just eating the whole thing. Okay. So osteoblasts are the matrix synthesizing cell responsible for bone growth. Remember, blasts build. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Okay, they monitor the matrix. Osteoclasts, think chew. They're going to be the bone reabsorbing cell that's responsible for breaking down the bone. Okay. And then on a very cellular level, bone is made up of organic and inorganic compounds. So this isn't super duper important, but just to understand how bone gets its strength. So organic compounds include the osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, bone lining cells, osteoclasts. So all of the cells and also the osteoid. Okay, so the osteoid again is that matrix that is secreted by osteoblasts. So it's made up of ground substance and collagen fibers, which contributes to the high tensile strength and flexibility of the bone. Okay, there's actually things called sacrificial bonds. This is just cool. In bones between different collagen molecules that can stretch and are made to break to dissipate energy and prevent fractures. Okay, so if you go through land on your legs really hard or something, jump off a building, your bones don't break, but I guarantee there's sacrificial bonds between the collagen molecules that will break to dissipate the energy to help protect the structural integrity of the bone. Okay, and those little breaks repair a lot more easily than bigger ones would. Like actual fractures. Okay, and then inorganic compounds, mostly hydroxyapatites, which we're just going to call mineral salts. I butchered that. They make up about 65% of the bone by mass. So a lot of your bone is just these inorganic salts. So different minerals, calcium phosphate crystals, mostly, that are found all around the collagen fibers that are responsible for the hardness and resistance to compression. Okay, so the bone's hardness is from the inorganic compounds, these mineral salts. The organic compounds, remember, with the collagen fibers and all of that, that is allowing more like flexibility in the bone, which you don't think of bones flexible, but it allows more tensile strength. Inorganic components make it harder and resistance to compression. Okay. This is cool. Bone's half as strong as steel in resisting compression and as strong as in resisting tension. You don't need to know that. And bones last long after death because of this mineral composition. Okay. So I'm going to stop here for part 1 of chapter 6. We'll talk about bone development and remodeling in part 2.